Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, thank you for joining me today. I know it's very sunny outside. We're very grateful to have you in your streaming studio talking to us this evening.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes I'm in my bedroom as well. I mean, it is nice to be able to have multi-use rooms, but yeah. But I mean, got the window open, lovely evening. Happy to be here.
Coming up tonight, the Kurdish PKK party have disbanded, ending their 40-year conflict, or more than 40-year conflict with the Turkish state. I'll speak to an expert on why. I have to say that one did take me by surprise. I didn't see that coming. Also, we will be discussing why journalists need to get tougher when they cover Gaza. You'll know this already, but we speak to Jeremy Corbyn. His independent group have printed out a series of booklets to give to lobby journalists. And finally, did Starmer, Macron and Merz take cocaine on a press junket? The answer might not actually surprise you, but it did become a right-wing conspiracy theory repeated by the Russian Foreign Ministry. We'll explain how that happened towards the end of the show. Now, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. We're making a big drive for new subscribers. We want to get a new studio. We want to expand as an organisation. What a difference 5 years makes. In 2020, this was what Keir Starmer said about migration, wages, housing and social services.
Low wages, poor housing, poor public services are not the fault of migrants and people who've come here. They're political failure. Political failure.
So that was pretty explicit. Wages, migrants, housing, social services, nothing to do with each other. If you talk about social services or housing as a problem, which is related to migration, you'd be wrong. It's a political problem. I suppose the implication, it's the Tories' fault. Got nothing to do with migration. By 2025, Starmer had clearly changed his mind, though.
We do have to ask why parts of our economy seem almost addicted to importing cheap labour, rather than investing in the skills of people who are here and want a good job in their community. Now, make no mistake, this plan means migration will fall. That's a promise. But I want to be very clear on this. If we do need to take further steps, if we do need to do more to release pressure on housing and our public services, then mark my words, we will.
You've got three strikes there. Before, migration and wages have nothing to do with each other. Now, businesses have been addicted to cheap migrant labour. Before, he's saying migration has nothing to do with housing and social services. Now, if there's even more strain on housing and social services than there has been, we'll go even further when it comes to cutting migration. Right, so complete 180. Let's use our time machine again to go back to the long lost past of 2020.
I think Conservatives have created this hostile environment, whether it's Windrush, whether it's the general response to immigration, or whether it's just the way the Home Office make their decisions. It's based on this idea that somebody's trying to cheat rather than actually based on an open, welcoming environment. I think we should welcome people wherever they come from, thank them for their contribution and see them as part of our families, our communities and our society.
So the problem in 2020 was that the Home Office looked at migrants as if they were trying to cheat the system. Instead, we should welcome people from wherever they come and see them as part of our communities and our families. Well, now let's fast forward to 2025.
Nations depend on rules, fair rules. Sometimes they're written down, often they're not. But either way, they give shape to our values, guide us towards our rights, of course, but also our responsibilities, the obligations we owe to each other. Now, in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Without them, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together. So when you have an immigration system that seems almost designed to permit abuse, that encourages some businesses to bring in lower paid workers rather than invest in our young people, or simply one that is sold by politicians to the British people on an entirely false premise, then you're not championing growth, You're not championing justice or however else people defend the status quo. You're actually contributing to the forces that are slowly pulling our country apart.
So I suppose you could say in his defence that he wasn't saying necessarily it was the migrants who were cheating the system. When he sort of looked at who is the target of this critique, he talked about employers relying on cheap labour, and he talked about politicians not being honest. So he wasn't explicitly sort of saying there are all these migrants who are trying to cheat the system. Maybe it was implicit and he didn't mind it being implicit. Let's look at some reaction though, because it was the strangers line, or the island of strangers line, that sort of provoked particularly strong pushback. Helena Horton from The Guardian said this: "I'm sad to hear Keir Starmer saying immigration is turning the UK into an island of strangers. People who have moved here from other countries are my friends and neighbours, not strangers." Now, again, in his defence, he didn't necessarily say immigration is turning the country into a nation of strangers. He was saying that the danger is that if immigration is too fast, and if it seems as if our rules aren't sort of collectively understood, that could risk turning into us an island of strangers. So I'm not necessarily sure that that's a fair sort of assessment of what he said. But let's go to Labour backbencher Nadia Whittam. She said, "The step up in anti-migrant rhetoric from the government is shameful and dangerous. Migrants are our neighbours, friends and family. To suggest that Britain risks becoming an island of strangers because of immigration mimics the scaremongering of the far right." Historian and researcher Taj Ali also made a comparison that lots of people have made today. So he's quoted Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech in 1968, which said they found themselves made strangers in their own country. And then Keir Starmer says, we risk becoming an island of strangers. Again, obviously, those two lines are somewhat similar. The rest of the speeches were quite different, because Keir Starmer's saying we are a diverse country. I completely celebrate that. He says that explicitly. But if change is too fast, if it seems as if rules aren't functioning, then it could become sort of something which breaks down social solidarity. I don't think Keir Starmer and Enoch Powell have that much in common, but I can see why that strangers line has rubbed lots of people up the wrong way. What is certain, though, is that Starmer's new approach to immigration doesn't sound much like the man who stood to be Labour leader in 2020. The clips we've shown you at the start of this show should, I think, be enough to prove that. Starmer, of course, might respond that that's only natural as the circumstances have changed. So when Starmer was speaking in 2020, net migration was just 250,000. After a dip during COVID, that rocketed in 2023 to an all-time high of 906,000. By June last year, that had fallen slightly to 728,000, which is still around 3 times higher than the rates that were usual before the COVID pandemic and when he was speaking. That increase, he'd say it wasn't something the public were consulted on. Most of the major parties agree it will have to come down to some degree. And that presumably makes some tightening of immigration rules, which existed under Boris Johnson when net migration was 900,000 and then 728,000, inevitable. So let's look at the changes Labour has landed on. This is via the BBC. English language requirements will be increased for all work visas, and they will be extended to apply to adult dependents. The time immigrants will have to live in the UK before they can apply for the right to stay indefinitely will be doubled to 10 years, but there will be a faster route for high-skilled, high-contributing people, and there'll be a dedicated visa for social care providers that want to recruit from abroad, introduced after Brexit, will be abolished. So the social care visa going. It goes on. The threshold for skilled work visas will be raised back to degree level, reversing a lowering to A-level made by Boris Johnson's government, with lower requirements remaining in key shortage sectors. And the time graduates can remain in the UK after their studies have finished will be cut from 2 years to 18 months. Now, Starmer says that combined, these policies will reduce net migration by over 100,000 people per year. It will affect all the main categories by which people can legally come to the UK. In 2024, over 400,000 people came on student visas. Starmer has reduced the time they can stay after they've finished their courses. 370,000 last year came on work visas. Starmer is now blocking off the social care visas, and also, I suppose, raising the threshold to be counted as a skilled worker. There were also around 80,000 people who came on family visas. Starmer is increasing their English language requirements. And there are also 40,000 people who arrived last year irregularly. These policies presumably won't really affect them that much, because it was a speech about legal or regular migration. So that's how Starmer hopes his changes will affect the net migration figures. But how will they affect the people behind those numbers, i.e. immigrants to Britain? To find out, I spoke earlier to Rivka Shaw from the Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit, which provides legal immigration advice and representation to people in northwest England.
There's a lot that we don't know yet about these changes, a lot of them about what the government's planning to do, and they haven't really put that much detail into what they're going to do and how. But the parts of it that really stuck out to us and that were particularly disappointing was making routes to settlement longer for many, many people. And to say a little bit more about that, we work with a lot of people in Greater Manchester in the Northwest who are already on the 10-year route to settlement. That means that they're in the UK based on their human right to family life or private life. And they already have to wait 10 years before they can get what's called indefinite leave to remain in the UK. During that time, they have to pay really extortionate visa fees every 2.5 years to renew their status. And during that process, they have the risk of falling out of status completely every time they renew. And 10 years, just from the people we work with and their experiences, 10 years is just an incredibly long time to put somebody through. A lot of the people we work with have already been in the UK for more than 10 years before they start that route. Many have been in the UK since they were children. It's just a really punishing route that people tell us causes financial hardship, debt, housing insecurity. So for us to see today that what the government plans to do is put many more people who are on different kinds of visas onto that 10-year route to settlement, that was pretty worrying.
So just to take a step back, so who currently has to wait 5 years for indefinite leave to remain or to apply for indefinite leave to remain, I suppose, because they're not always going to sort of succeed in getting it. But who currently has to wait 5 years and who currently has to wait 10 years? And I suppose the change is to make everyone 10 years, but just so we're clear on who these changes will affect.
Of course, yeah. So at the moment, a lot of people who are on work-based visas, meaning that their visa is sponsored by an employer, have to accrue 5 years of that kind of leave before they can then apply for indefinite leave to remain. And there are also people on some family visas who are on a 5-year route. And those are the people that are subject to what's called the minimum income requirement, which has also just gone up recently. But yeah, those are the people, mainly people on work-based visas and family visas, who will be being put from a 5-year route to a 10-year route to settlement.
And what do you make of the language restrictions? Because they've extended the time. So instead of, as you just explained, some people being on a 5-year and some people being on a 10-year track to get indefinite leave to remain, everyone will be on 10 years. And as far as I understand, the plan is to increase the requirements to learn English so that it's English as a foreign language at GCSE level, which it currently is, to English as a foreign language at A-level. Does that to you seem significant? Will that affect lots of people?
I think you can give people more hoops to jump through to be able to get their lawful status, to be able to bring their family with them when they're building a life in the UK. But I think ultimately I find it quite difficult to take these policies seriously and the government's claims that they're about integration seriously, because I think a government serious about integration and serious about making our communities a more kind of cohesive and safe place for everyone to live. A government that was serious about that would be making it easier to settle permanently, not harder. Because I think long-term residents being able to settle in the UK is good for all of us. It means dedicated care workers being able to build their lives here. It means students who come to our universities and who are propping up our universities with their international fees, being able to see themselves building a career here, maybe bringing family here. All of that is good for all of our communities. It benefits all of us. And I think it's just such a shame to see the government failing to admit that.
And I suppose, from the government's perspective, net migration was a couple of years ago at 900,000. Last year, it was at 750,000. Now, if any politician had suggested that would be the case 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there would have been uproar. And there wasn't sort of public consent for numbers like that. So I suppose, from your perspective, do you accept that a politician sort of in Britain right now can't help but sort of say they'll do something to bring those numbers down? And I suppose a secondary question, if you were to accept that, then what do you think would be the least harmful ways to try and reduce the overall numbers of people coming to Britain?
I think I would rather have a government that didn't accept that framing. I think, as we all know, a lot of this pressure is coming from the far right, and that's a far right that's never going to be satisfied with any of these measures. They're already saying it's not enough. But I don't think it makes sense to set an arbitrary figure on what that net migration number could be or should be. As we've already seen, as you say, it's already started coming down. That's because you can bring that number down by reducing the number of visas issued. You can do that. That's what they've done. That's what they're saying they'll do. And the result for the government will be just at a lower net migration number they can point at and say, look, we've done this. But I don't think that really does very much for us as a country. We've got over 100,000 vacancies in the care sector, and I've not heard any credible plans to fill those, particularly with stopping care worker visas being issued. So a lot of these plans, yes, they will reduce that figure, but no, I don't think it's going to make our communities any better. And as for many of the other plans outlined today, they'll have no effect on that figure at all because they're about punishing people already here.
And so that's specifically the sort of settled status stuff. So you're saying that's not going to reduce overall numbers. That's just making people who are already here a little bit more insecure than they otherwise would be.
Absolutely. I mean, we know at Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit, we know from our research on migrant destitution, and we know from our research on the 10-year route to settlement, that putting people through legal and financial hell, making their status really insecure, doesn't make them disappear. They're still here. People will still be here, and people who were going to be here for 5 years will then be here for 10 years and later will become citizens. But as you say, it's just keeping people kind of stuck in this insecurity, this instability for far longer, and making it much harder for them to kind of settle, flourish and contribute to society.
That was Rivka Shaw from the Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit, and there has also been opposition to Starmer's plans from industry groups, in particular universities seem. I'm concerned about an idea floated by the government but not yet confirmed, which would involve imposing a 6% levy on international student fees. The chief executive of Universities UK said this, following years of frozen fees, inadequate research funding and a rapid downturn in international students. The current operating environment is very challenging. We would urge government to think carefully about the impact that a levy on international student fees will have on universities and the attractiveness of the UK as a study destination. Representatives for the care industry are also up in arms, this time about the ending of the social care visa route. The chief executive of Care England said this is a crushing blow to an already fragile sector. The government is kicking us while we're already down. For years, the sector has been propping itself up with dwindling resources, rising costs and mounting vacancies. International recruitment wasn't a silver bullet, but it was a lifeline. Taking it away now, but with no warning, no funding and no alternative, is not just short-sighted, it's cruel. Helena, I want your views on this. What did you make of Starmer's big immigration announcement?
Well, I think the first thing to start off with is saying that this is the democratic will of the electorate. The electorate have consistently said, both in terms of who they voted for and in opinion polls, that they want to see migration go down. And every single year since this kind of dynamic has started, it keeps going up, and to the point where we had a very large increase in the overall net migration figure, as we've seen since the pandemic. Now, it's obviously there is some backlog there. There's about people coming in with like refugee status in that kind of period with Ukraine. Like, there are some things and caveats to those numbers, but people do want to see the migration numbers come down, and the government do need to look like they are actually doing what they said they would do and what the electorate continually wants. I obviously disagree personally. I've been very outspoken in saying that I think that migration is a good thing for the country more broadly, and attacks on it are bad, and it's the framing of this that is worth critiquing too. But I know I'm in the minority, right? The government was elected on a platform of bringing migration down, and they're doing what they said they would do, which is, quite frankly, at least one thing that they say they're going to do that they actually do, unlike everything else, which seems to be U-turns, right? So that's one thing to put to one side. When it comes to the framing, though, the economic framing versus the social framing is what's super important here, because when you look at the economic framing, you can make the case, I think it is incorrect, by the way, that you import people with low skills and that drives down wages. There is a lot of understanding of this. Joseph Stiglitz was on Laura Kunzberg over the weekend pointing out that actually migrants influence both supply and demand. So it doesn't necessarily dilute wages unless you have certain distortions in the labour market with specific kinds of workers coming over. So that expands the supply in one area, but demand stays higher in other areas. So it's difficult to understand that in a very simple terms as the dilution of the labour market or driving down wages when it's not necessarily true. The issue comes, right, when you can stop blaming bosses like Keir Starmer did, which is fine, in rhetorical terms, and then you start moving on to this social framing, or we're becoming an island of strangers. I think that's really dangerous rhetoric to try and imply that somehow I'm a stranger to somebody else just because they were born in a different part of the world, or they're of a different culture, a different skin color or nationality or whatever. I've fundamentally reject that rhetoric and that framing. I mean, we have become an island of strangers. I do believe that that's true, but this is a neoliberalism problem. right? This is an issue that we have with the destruction of community, the severing of the bonds between us, whether it is with the public realm or whether even the decline of religion and religious institutions that haven't been replaced by social institutions. These are all problems. And I find this use of immigration as being this kind of patient zero that people think of it as this kind of destruction of community rather than Thatcherism is a real red herring that is going to cause a lot of social tension that I don't want to see. So that's where I think the rhetoric is really, really problematic coming out from Keir Starmer and the government. Another issue that we have is that we constantly talk in number terms. We say, net migration was this specific number in this specific time, this is terrible, rather than discussing the utility of what's going on here. For example, I talked about Ukrainian refugees. This was a very specific time when, again, post-pandemic, we'd seen a surge. And also, when it comes to student visas being gifted out, look, not all of these people are going to stay in the UK. These might go away 3 years later, for example. They may not stay here forever. And when they do come here, they're essentially purchasing an export good from us. We have some of the best and most prestigious universities in the world. And I think it's a great thing. People want to come to our country, take their foreign capital and spend it here on our services that we provide to them. I think this is a good thing for our economy. It keeps our universities afloat. It subsidizes our universities so that we don't have to increase fees. So people from poorer backgrounds find it easier to be able to afford to go to universities, which is what this subsidy is doing. And it's keeping universities afloat. And as we've seen, the problem will be is that this might not be the case if these numbers are reduced, just because the number being big as part of net migration is too high at a certain point. That can deal some economic damage that I have a problem with. When it comes to the care sector, when it comes to recruitment, the response has always been, just recruit from the UK. Just recruit from the UK. Well, when we have record low unemployment? Well, I mean, it was 3% a couple of years ago. It's increased about 4% now, but that's still historically incredibly low in terms of unemployment, right? The last time we had this low unemployment, James Callaghan was Prime Minister of this country. That's how low the unemployment level is. Where are you going to recruit from? And of course, the line comes, from Chris Philp this weekend saying, we have 9 million people, out of work, 9 million people, And out of those 9 million, half of these people are carers or students. So this idea that somehow this massive glut of people that you can just draw on, and whilst we should be training people to be care workers, we should be investing in our domestic workforce, there has been an absolute lack of public spending in this area, expecting the free market to pick up the slack when it has not done. And I welcome that from the government looking into funding these areas. That's not a silver bullet. We can't just train people overnight. This takes years and years of training. So cutting off the supply of people who need to come in and do these jobs whilst we wait for these people to be trained up, even though we don't even know where these people are going to come from because of how few people are there available to go into work in the first place anyway, seems like delusional politics chasing, as I said, the dropping of a certain number for political reasons rather than a broader holistic look at what our economy does or doesn't need. And to finish off with, if we're going to look at a holistic idea of what our economy needs, what it needs is productive capacity. We have an aging population. The ratio of retired to working age people is as skewed as it's ever been in this country historically. And our birth rate is low. And the more that we cut off our supply of people to actually engage in productive capacity and be people who do the work that produce the things that are consumed by those who don't work, such as the retired, that's going to mean higher taxation, it's going to mean lower growth, and it's going to mean we have a demographic ticking time bomb that this country's economy is unlikely to survive. So I understand all of the reasons why people want to see migration come down in economic terms. I just think that it is totally unsustainable for us to think of these things purely in numerical terms rather than looking at a broader and more overarching discussion of what actually will happen to our economy if these things are put in place.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you say there. I suppose I'm not, because you're sort of saying they have to bring down migration because that's sort of the democratic mandate of them. But the only way they should ever talk about it is in economic terms, not in social, cultural terms. But I do think that if someone says they want their community to change a bit sort of more slowly so that they know more of their neighbours or that they have something in common with more of their neighbours, I don't necessarily think that's the end of the world, which I suppose was, if he was saying that there are too many non-white people in our society, which means we're in a society of strangers, that would obviously be completely racist and terrible. But if he's saying if this all happens too quickly, if there's no sense of control, then sort of social trust will break down. And there's social scientific evidence. I think Robert Putnam, sort of most famously, wrote it, where he's saying that ethnic diversity is sometimes negatively correlated with social trust, because when people are different, it takes a bit more work to sort of build up social trust. That doesn't mean we shouldn't live in ethnically diverse places. I've grown up in London. I've lived in London my whole life. I love it. I trust my neighbours. But I think it might mean that you have to put in a bit more work as a government, and maybe doing it not as fast as having 900,000 people a year makes sense, which to me is why, yeah, maybe he said the strangest line because he wants it to get picked up by the right-wing press and he wants to have a row about whether or not he sounds like Enoch Powell. Maybe that is the sort of cynical ploy here. But if you take literally what he said, I don't actually find any of it sort of, if it's taken literally, objectionable. But I suppose you do.
I mean, the thing is, what I would say is, I go back to the point I meant about like the breakdown of community being, again, an economic problem in my mind. I say, so, well, people find that their communities are changing and they don't know or trust their neighbours. I'm like, well, when I lived in Salford, it was mostly communities full of people who were born in the UK, and I didn't know my neighbours because in 2 years' time I was forced to move because my landlord was selling up. As a permanent renter for 10 years or so, I never really knew any of my neighbours because I never had any time to actually get to know my community or build a community at all because of this level of economic precarity. Whereas now I'm a homeowner. I live in the area that I live. I know all of my neighbours because I have a community that I've been able to build, because I know that I have some level of stability. I know that I'm going to be here for a very, very long time. And that was something that you got in the council estates of yesteryear, where it didn't matter where you were from or what part of the country you're from. As long as you were living in that estate, you all knew each other because that level of stability was there. And that's all gone under the banner of free market dogma and the idea that there is no such thing as society. So I understand where you're coming from, but I just think that if we want to try and move people away from the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing coming out of the far right that's being pushed about social cohesion being entirely down to changing ethnic or racial demographics, I think we have to talk about these things in economic terms, because I fully agree, I fully submit to the idea that it's an economic problem that has caused our communities to be less cohesive than we had before.
I mean, I totally agree with you in terms of priorities. I definitely think Keir Starmer should be making the front and centre pledge. I'm going to build so many houses that, private renters don't have to move all the time, that you can live close to your family, so that you don't have to move to a different city, so that you can afford to have kids. That should definitely be front and centre. I suppose my problem with his stance on migration is that he's made this his centrepiece policy, which is stupid. And I think will only take sort of the conversation to the right, because he's not sort of talking about anything else. But I suppose if this was a sort of side announcement, I don't think I would mind it that much. It's that this is the centre of his platform that for me is the problem. And I do think that
that's the thing.
Yeah. Go on.
Yeah, so I was going to say, actually, sorry to cut you off there, but someone was mentioning in my Discord today how the actual scale of what will be reduced in terms of net migration from these policy announcements is actually pretty low, probably 100,000 fewer, which I don't think will be enough, the kind of anti-migration types anyway. Yet the scale of the announcement and the rhetoric is very, very heavy. And that's not what you want to do, because then people will hear you saying things and then they'll see the results and then they'll see a mismatch and then they'll dislike you for it, as if you're trying to hoodwink them. When in reality, if you want to do these things, do these things whilst not giving into the rhetoric from elsewhere, do these things quietly, make the changes quietly, let the numbers come down more dramatically, make bigger changes, but don't make it the centerpiece of your campaign, because if you fail, you just hand all the impetus to your opponent. So what happened to Rishi Sunak? He had stop the boats all over everything that he had in his campaign material, and then he didn't stop the boats. It was this big front and centre campaign, and they failed because the scope of what they were going to try and do was so small. And all it did was push people away from them. So I don't think it's politically savvy to do what they're doing either.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. 100% agree with that. I suppose my only concern is when everyone says, this is the terrible fascist rhetoric, and I think that probably lots of people of all different races and ethnic backgrounds look at this and say, I kind of see what you're saying there. I feel like the feigning of outrage is, well, not necessarily that everyone is feigning it. I feel like the outrage is potentially a little bit overdone. My beef is that he's not talking about other things as his front and centre policy. He should be talking about building all these houses. And also, by the way, of course, I'm going to bring down immigration a bit. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, has been in an armed struggle against the Turkish state since 1984. But now, more than 40 years after that struggle began, the PKK is disbanding following peace negotiations with Turkey. The party held its congress in Iraq last week, publishing this closing statement today. The extraordinary 12th Congress evaluated that the PKK's struggle has dismantled the policies of denial and annihilation imposed on our people, bringing the Kurdish issue to a point where it can be resolved through democratic politics. It concluded that the PKK has fulfilled its historic mission. Based on this, the 12th Congress resolved to dissolve the PKK's organizational structure and end the armed struggle. Prescribed as a terrorist organization in Turkey, the US, and the UK, the PKK was founded in 1978. It initially fought for an independent Kurdish state in the southeast of Turkey in response to the country's suppression of Kurds within its borders. Influenced by Marx as well as other anti-imperialist movements, it recruited fighters from Syria, Iraq, and Iran, as well as from Western countries. It also argued for total gender equality, actively recruiting women fighters, politicians, and leaders to its ranks. Following the Turkish military coup of 1980, the Kurdish language was banned in Turkey, leading to the arrest and persecution of thousands of Kurds. And in 1984, the PKK announced the Kurdish uprising, a conflict that has continued until today. In that time, some 40,000 people are thought to have been killed, mostly Kurdish civilians, as a result of violent repression by Turkish forces, including abductions, torture, executions, and forced displacement. In the mid-90s, the PKK changed its political stance, abandoning the demand for an independent Kurdish state and instead calling for the full recognition of Kurds within the Turkish state, including a degree of political autonomy and equal rights. But Turkish suppression continued, and following wars in Iraq and Syria, the PKK found a new enemy, battling the spread of Islamic State Kurdish areas of Iraq and Syria, or challenging the spread of Islamic State in those Kurdish areas, and of course also while continuing the struggle against Turkey. It's not yet known what the group's decision to disband will mean for these goals, with negotiations between the PKK and Turkey taking place behind closed doors. But the decision to dissolve follows an intervention by the group's imprisoned leader, Abdullah Öcalan. Öcalan co-founded the PKK in 1978, leading the group into the armed conflict with Turkey in 1984. In 1999, he was captured by Turkish operatives in Nairobi and has been held on an island prison in the Sea of Marmara ever since. And for the first 10 years of his sentence, Öcalan was the island's only prisoner, and in February this year, he called for the PKK to lay down arms. 4 days later, on the 1st of March, the PKK declared a ceasefire in their conflict with the Turkish state, which was the precursor to today's disbanding. So what are the implications of the PKK coming to an end? Well, it's thought to be a win for Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He will reportedly run for a fourth term, requiring a change to the Turkish constitution, which limits presidents to 3 terms. And the disbanding of the PKK means that he can claim victory where others have failed, namely ending what Turkey calls Kurdish terrorism in the country. It also means he might win the support of Kurdish voters and Kurdish parties. Now, to find out more, I'm joined now by Elif Sarican, a Kurdish writer who also manages strategic operations at the Decolonial Centre. Thank you so much for joining us. To get us going, I suppose, I was always under the impression that the Kurdish movement and Erdogan were mortal enemies. I mean, I've obviously only been sort of following this passively, but for me to sort of see this news that they've now made a deal, this sort of completely came out of the blue to me. So can you sort of give us some background? What's been going on here?
The Kurdish movement broadly and Erdogan as an individual are not the ones who have been mortal enemies. As you described actually in your introduction, the PKK and the Kurdish movement came about in the 70s and actually came about in a broader context in the 60s within the broader anti-imperialist movement within Turkey, fighting against particularly US imperialism and also NATO expansion. And at the time, the Kurdish, what was a Kurdish group, not a movement at the time, fought to include the reality and the experience of the millions of Kurdish people within Turkey in those struggles. And in many ways that was the case. But at the same time, the political situation within the Turkish state meant that those demands, as with other anti-imperialist, leftist and socialist demands, were crushed in many ways. And at the time, the Kurdish movement was one of the only movements that managed to survive some of the context that you refer to as well, particularly the 1980s coup d'etat, the fascist coup that meant that the country was ruled by a military, so martial law for some time, and expanded into a broad movement. The issue was never with one particular president or obviously with the Turkish people or anyone. It was against the policies and the foundations actually that the Turkish Republic was built on in 1923 following the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was built on one nation, one flag, one language, one religion. So the constitution and the entire system was built in a way that it wouldn't allow the reality of another peoples, and in this case the Kurdish people, but also others. Many will probably know about the Armenian genocide and also the pogroms that like Greek communities faced in Turkey and other minorities and communities as well.
And I suppose I just want to really get to the bottom of what's changed, because I suppose, I said I thought they were sort of mortal enemies, and you've said obviously the Kurdish movement massively predates Erdogan coming to power.
Yeah.
My understanding was also that when he first came to power, it was in kind of with support of some sort of Kurdish movements in the country. But in recent years, my understanding had been that there'd been basically military repression in eastern Turkey of sort of people who were thought to be Kurdish separatists. I think he tried to ban one of the other Kurdish parties, didn't he, that wasn't officially related to the PKK, but he said they were. And then there's been many times also on the show, and we've been discussing Rojava, so the Kurdish or the independent Kurdish-led movement in Syria, where the Turkish armed forces were used to sort of, kick them out of Afrin, for example. So in my mind, even if the Kurdish movement sort of its key aim wasn't ever sort of to oppose Erdogan, my understanding is that these two, this president and this group had been at massive loggerheads, often bloody loggerheads for a very long time. And so what's changed? What's led to this sudden sort of shift whereby the PKK is saying that they've achieved their demands and so can afford to disband?
The reason why that is, we can't know for sure. What I think is the Turkish state, as well as Öcalan and the PKK, is able to see the massive changes happening across the region, across the Middle East right now. And I think for the Turkish state, it's important that they are also able to stay, relevant in these changes. Turkey particularly wants a stake in Syria. Also has close relations with the current Jolani government, the HTS government in Syria. He obviously, his Turkish state's proxies still occupy parts of northern Syria, particularly Afrin, but also parts of some other, pockets of Syria as well. So I think part of it is probably to do with Syria. I think part of it is to do with the broader region. We can speculate around the geopolitics. There's probably, talk around Iran. There's probably talk with the US around some of the US's plans for the Middle East, and obviously Turkey wants to and has always wanted to be a very significant, at least regional actor, if not, globally. Turkey already has ambitions in parts of Africa. Its aid programs in Somalia, in its involvement in the horrific war in Sudan and other regions of the African continent as well. So, this is a state that wants to be relevant, wants to have a say in global politics, and also, I think it's important to remind ourselves that Turkey is a NATO ally. So possibly, there was a shift in also the approach that, we need to sort out our own doorstep before we can actually, embark on our actual regional ambitions. This is possibly a part of it too. The aim of any struggle is peace in the end. Perpetual, particularly armed struggle, is never the aim. And, especially with, especially people like us who are in the comfort of our own homes, it's also important to understand who suffers from war the most, who suffers from armed struggle the most. You described yourself as well, out of the 40 to 50,000 lives lost in the last few decades of struggle has mostly been Kurdish civilians, and those Kurdish civilians have mostly been people, Kurdish people who are poor, who are peasants, and who are working class people. So in many ways, also the starting of a new stage of shifting to a more democratic struggle, a political struggle in the process or on the road to peace is also in many ways trying to achieve class victory as well.
It's no secret that Britain's legacy media has been embarrassingly weak when it comes to calling out Israel's genocide in Gaza and holding our own politicians in Britain to account for their complicity in it. But now, the Independent Alliance of MPs in Parliament is trying to help journalists in the parliamentary lobby find a little bit of courage. They've distributed a handbook called Journalism During a Genocide to every lobby hack, giving them a guide to holding the Prime Minister to account. The Independent Alliance, as you'll probably know, is made up of former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, as well as Shokat Adam, Ayub Khan, Adnan Hussein and Iqbal Mohammed. And in the handbook for journalists, they set out their aims, saying this. Since the government was elected in July 2024, the Prime Minister has held numerous press conferences to mark a range of policy announcements, from increases in military spending to the development of a theme park. These press conferences are an opportunity for the British media to hold the Prime Minister to account over the government's role in Israel's military assault on Gaza. To that end, we trust this handbook will assist you in establishing truth and accountability. The handbook contains sample questions for journalists to put to senior politicians. These include, when will the government publish a full list of military shipments from the UK to Israel since October 2023? And will the government release video footage from RAF spy planes that have flown over Gaza? That latter question is a reference to a declassified investigation published in March, showing that Britain has sent over 500 spy flights over Gaza since December 2023. Speaking to Novara's Harriet Williamson outside Parliament today, Jeremy Corbyn explained why the Independent Alliance had made the guides.
This is about journalism during genocide. And what it's doing is asking questions about the inadequacies of our journalists since October 23. Well, before that, but let's take it to that date. We've seen Israel now kill over 60,000 people in Gaza. We've seen a continued supply of arms and a route to supply arms through the Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri. And we now understand that 15% of all F-35 jets are made in Britain, 15% of the parts. And so Britain is in a uniquely powerful position amongst European countries to stop the genocide in Gaza. Where have the journalists been in all this? Have they just been complicit, or do they not want to speak out, or are they afraid of something? I don't know what it is. We're witnessing something atrocious in history. And when the history of the 21st century is written, people will say, where were the great journalists of the past?
What do you see in terms of the most positive outcome sort of coming from the Independence Alliance's media handbooks that have been placed this morning?
That it will wake a few journalists up. It will make them ask some questions, and it will wake up many people around the country who will increasingly realise that they've been shortchanged by mainstream media. And this book gives them the chance to say to their papers they read, the radio stations they listen to, the TV channels they watch, ask the questions, because we are observing genocide in real time. I think what this war has shown is how the mainstream media are so in hock to governments, so in hock to commercial lobby interests that they are making themselves increasingly irrelevant, and people search for their news elsewhere.
While British legacy journalists have been incredibly slow to condemn Israel's genocide, there has been some movement recently. So last week, the FT's editorial board published an article in the paper condemning what it called the West's shameful silence on Gaza, and it called on the US and European allies of Israel to do more to restrain Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. A couple of days later, The Economist published a similar leader from its editors calling for the war in Gaza to end. On Sunday, The Independent's front page led with a similar editorial calling for an end to the deafening silence on Gaza. And on the same day, The Guardian called on Trump to stop the horror in Gaza or risk being understood as implicitly approving of Netanyahu's plan for the total destruction of the enclave. Now, that's a lot of editorials in just a week. Of course, they're all coming many, many months too late. As you know, we at Novara have been clear about what Israel is doing in Gaza over the last 18 months. Genocide, a term we've been using since 2023. It was obvious all along. Helena, what do you make of this sort of flurry of editorials from sort of the FT, The Economist? I mean, The Economist especially, they were Shashank Joshi, he's obviously an intelligent man, but he was one of the people sort of really sharing all of the most outlandish claims about what happened on October the 7th, and then sort of haranguing people, myself included, who dared to say, do we really have strong evidence for this? So I don't take their sort of claim that now they're really on the side of the Palestinians or they're on the side of human rights very seriously, but there we are. Do you think this change is significant?
I think it is very significant, and I'm glad to see that we're trying to push as well in terms of elected MPs trying to push journalists to ask more probing questions too, because these are things that have been completely neglected. Whereas it's fine, you want to give an outline of all sides of a conflict to everybody. Of course, there's going to be conflicting information, conflicting reports, there's going to be different viewpoints, but the issue is that we only saw one side of that for so long. No one bothered interrogating the underlying reasons for this. It was all so much of broadcast of all of the horrors from the genocide that we've seen, with the accompanying like, oh dear, isn't this sad, rather than doing what journalism should be, which is to inform the public and let people know why we're here, how we got here, how this is allowed to happen. And I think that a lot of the heel turn that we've seen very, very recently, since the outspoken desires of the Likud government have been broadcast to the world, right? Israel Katz doesn't need to be shy in his words about their desires to conquer Gaza, to annex the enclave, right? That's been something they've wanted to do for ages, but it's been implicit rather than explicit for so long. And our journalists, rather than I think being caught up in a kind of a government kind of sphere of things, I think there's a groupthink, especially in the UK. I think the UK is uniquely bad for the kind of journalistic groupthink that we have, especially since over half of our journalists all went to private school, compared to 7% of the population, in that they've all kind of imbibed a bunch of received wisdom about what Israel represents specifically when it comes to how they view its history and how they view the way it acts geopolitically. For example, they don't understand the realities of Zionism or what the Likud party represents, and they don't even necessarily recognize the plight of the Palestinian people historically in the way it should be. Like for so long, especially amongst like older generations of this country, they bought into this foundation myth of Israel that the Palestinians just kind of left because Arab armies told them to, and then Israel heroically fought back the Arabs and then took the lands that were there and emptied because of their hubris, rather than the reality, which is something that we only found out really from the new historians in the West coming out with a bunch of the information around the Nakba from declassified IDF documents that were released 30, 40 years later. And that information didn't really catch up to the groupthink that's been part of the British state, the British establishment, kind of the private school system as well throughout that time period. And this has been passed down throughout our journalistic class for so long that they don't understand the reality of what's happened to the Palestinians and what the Israelis desired right from the start. Rather the colonization project that it obviously was, because these things never really got reported on in the way that it should have been, or taught to our journalists in the way that it should have been before. So the heel turn, I think, is very convenient for them, essentially doing what I've been saying that's been coming for a long time. Lots of people saying, oh, well, I opposed it the whole time, I was never part of this. When in reality, a lot of these people really were, and this is them trying to save face once they realise what they have been complicit in, or at least ambivalent towards, that's been happening for the last 19 months. And there was also a case of a kind of snap education for a lot of people, having to unlearn a lot of the received wisdom of the past 75 years that has come into sharp relief since we've seen this broadcast throughout the entirety of the conflict in Gaza.
We've got an update about Novara Media next. So a few months ago, we asked you guys to nominate the show for the Amnesty People's Choice Award, and you really came through. So we're pleased to say that Ash Sarkar and I have now been jointly shortlisted for the award for journalism on Novara Live. If you like our work, you can vote for us at amnesty.org.uk/castyourvote. That link is also in the description below. And do feel free to spread the word. Voting closes on the 20th of May. This weekend, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer all found themselves on a long train journey to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Now it sounds like the beginning of a murder mystery. But don't worry, the only thing that died was the critical faculties of Twitter's most energetic conspiracy theorists. News agency AFP captured the moment behind the storm when the three men met, and it has caused a storm online. So let's have a look.
Make a photo, and after that you will be allowed to have a drink. Yeah. Super.
So what did we see there? Well, the context is the three leaders meeting, sitting down, and Macron says, we'll take a photo, and after that we'll have a drink. Then you can see Merz sort of takes something off the table, and Macron puts something white under his arm. Now, it looked like Macron was sort of putting a used tissue under his arm, but that's not how the foil helmet saw it. This was from Alex Jones. So he says, breaking, it's Coke. One investigator expanded on that theory with this. It's quite a convincing video, to be honest. Obviously, they're suggesting it was a tiny spoon in Merz's hand, the one that if you're very organised, you might use to take cocaine. Potentially, it could also be one of those small skewers you sometimes get in fingers sandwiches, like these ones holding mini hamburgers together. I can imagine these being on a train to Kyiv. At any rate, it didn't take long for Russia to hop on board the rumour train. Kremlin Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova posted this on Telegram. She says, after pushing Zelensky into yet another hellish scheme to derail a settlement and prolong the bloodshed in Europe, it's like a joke. A Frenchman, an Englishman, and a German got on the train and did a line. Apparently they were so out of it, they forgot to hide the paraphernalia, a small bag and a spoon before the journalists arrived. Europe's fate is in the hands of placeholders who are dependent in every sense of the word. Sort of geopolitically dependent on the United States and personally all addicted to cocaine. The French government has responded to the cocaine claims saying this. So this says, when European unity becomes inconvenient, disinformation goes so far as to make a simple tissue look like drugs. This fake news is being spread by France's enemies, which include Alex Jones and Russia, both abroad and at home. We must remain vigilant against manipulation. So you can see this is a tissue for blowing your nose. This is European unity to build peace. So that was them fighting back in witty social media terms. Helena, I can see why Alex Jones would sort of jump on this, gets you clicks. I suppose, the Russian Foreign Ministry is now just trolling. But, it's strange, isn't it? It's strange to sort of have the Russian Foreign Ministry sort of back up this conspiracy theory, which is so obviously wrong. Well, I suppose maybe to a certain audience it's not obviously wrong. What do you make of it?
It's funny, the justification people had for saying, well, it must be a cocaine paper bag because Emmanuel Macron hid it immediately as soon as he sat down. Like, no, he's posing for a photograph that's going over. He doesn't want there to be a snotty tissue on the table. It didn't seem particularly difficult to understand to me. The point you make about Russia is actually really interesting. So a lot of the interactions that Russia has had on things like social media in actually wanting specifically to spread conspiracy theories like this has always been part of their non-linear warfare strategy. This is a Vladislav Surkov special that we see, with regards to, say something similar that was recent, very, very recent. Remember the Iman Khalif stuff? A bunch of this stuff was just a conspiracy theory about her being transgender or intersex, whatever, that was spread by a Russian institution, right? Again, to try and sow discord. They know full well over in the there's a specific office they have for this kind of digital misinformation stuff over in Russia. It was controlled by the government. And they have deliberately tried to create disunity and discordance within societies that they deem to be their enemy. And of course, that's not saying that Western institutions haven't done this. They historically have done. You have to look at things that the Ned did in Yugoslavia, whatever, for example. Sowing societal discord is something that's very easy to do in the internet era, where you can see crackpots believing any old shit, like that there was a bag of cocaine on the desk that they just filmed and then also just broadcast, obviously. Like this shouldn't be something that should be difficult to understand. But in a world where knowledge travels fast and misinformation can go 3 times around the world before anybody started debunking it. This is a really good way to sow levels of lack of unity within societies that are already breaking down due to a bunch of environmental, geopolitical, economic factors, that people are very much more amenable to conspiratorial thinking in this world. And we have seen it ever since the pandemic has come around in this way. So I'm not surprised to see Russia jump on something that should seem very, very frivolous, a bunch of conspiracy nutcases saying a bunch of dumb things on the internet. And then the official Russian account wants to drive this, try and spread these things that cause disunity, because that makes it much harder to try and create a unifying discussion or narrative or any kind of normalcy amongst the political discussion if these things come to light. Like the way in which the Imam Khalif story just kind of tore apart huge sections of the discourse in Western countries was crazy. And it was all based upon some kind of myth that was perpetuated by a Russian institution. So it's important that every single country is vigilant for these kind of disinformation campaigns everywhere, whether it's coming from the West or from the East.
Very well put. Let's wrap up there, Helena. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. A pleasure as always.
Absolutely a pleasure as always. I'll see you next time.
You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.